What's up, guys? Welcome back to another daily Bible reading snapshot. Today we're looking at Ezekiel chapter 40 here in the Old Testament. Just one chapter, but there's so much to say about it because this is a very hard chapter to interpret. And a lot of people will look at this next section and say, wow, there's a lot of different ways that this can go. But the most important thing is that God is promising to do something glorious in the future. God is promising to make a brand new place for these Israelites to live. He's just said he's going to give them a new heart. He's just said he's going to rebuild them. He's just said he's going to fight this battle to protect them. Now, what is the land going to look like? What is it going to be like to be in this new kingdom with God? Well, he describes that in the next few chapters. But here in chapter 40, we see a vision of a new temple. This is a different temple than the temple we saw before. Remember, we already saw visions of the temple in chapter 8, 9, and 10. And even chapter 11, we see Ezekiel being lifted from this area in exile. Now God shows him all the bad stuff that's going on in the temple in Jerusalem. And he says, see how evil this is. Go measure the place. Go see how bad it is. That's what he's doing. Just instead of looking back, God's showing him a new temple in the future. Now, there's a lot of ways that this can go because, first of all, here's what's undisputed about this. In the first verse, I think we're describing the year 573 BC. So this is in the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, the 14th year after the city was struck down. On that very day, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me to the city. Okay, the city, what city? Jerusalem, right? But is it the same city? Well, it is the same city, yet he's going to describe this temple that's being built that is so much bigger than any temple that was ever built there. And that's kind of the problem. We look at this and say, well, didn't the Israelites rebuild a temple? Is that what he's talking about here? It's not that simple, because the next couple of days, we're going to be reading detailed descriptions about this temple. The problem is this temple is huge. This temple is massive compared to anything that we saw before and anything that came after. So here's the question. Is this a figurative temple that's going to be taking place in the new heavens and the new earth? Or is this something that God is describing in particular detail with great specificity that is going to take place in the future? I think that's the best way to understand it. That this temple and all the measurements, it's meant to be taken literally because of all the specific measurements. It's you don't describe something that's figurative with all these specific measurements, and I went to that door and it looked like that, and all these different details about a structure. It doesn't seem like it's to be taken figuratively. It seems like God's going to build this temple someday, but then we ask the question, when does he build it? Well, before we even get into that question, I just want you to remember, as you're looking at all the details and think, oh, why do I have to read details about a building? Remember, the Bible doesn't have pictures, right? But the Bible paints a lot of pictures. And one of the pictures it paints is of a blueprint, a floor plan. That's what's being described here in chapter 40. But remember, in the Old Testament, how often God describes buildings that he cares about. He describes the tabernacle and the very specific ways the Israelites are supposed to put it together in detail. For 15 chapters in the book of Exodus, God describes it. Then we see more description of the temple later on. And now we're seeing description of the future temple. So remember, God cares so much about it, and that's why he's describing it in such detail. Also, remember that as we're dealing with this temple, when does this temple get built? Well, it hasn't been built yet. So that's a problem for us. If this hasn't been built yet, either God's unfaithful to his promises, or either this is not really what God meant. He meant something else by giving us this temple design, or God's going to fulfill it in the future. And I think that's the best way of understanding it. So the inner court, the outer court, the north gate, south gate, the chamber for the priest, the vestibule for the temple, all of this is being described. It's a huge temple, a huge courtyard, and inside we see some description. Now, we're going to read more about that later, but the thing I want you to see is that God is very specific in his promises and in his fulfillment. I don't think that God makes such specific promises without having specific fulfillment. So we're going to talk more about that in the days to come. But in the New Testament, we're finishing the book of 1 Peter today. 1 Peter chapter 5, Peter tells the elders, which are the pastors and the overseers, right? All three of those names are talking about the same office, the office of elder, pastor, overseer. Sometimes they're called bishops, right? A lot of fancy churches might use those titles, right? But we usually use the title shepherd or elder or pastor. He says those people need to take special care of their flock. Remember, in Ezekiel 34, God said about the Israelite leaders, the shepherds for Israel, they were bad shepherds. Now, Peter tells these shepherds, which remember, shepherd and pastor is the same exact word, means the same thing. Pastor means shepherd. He says, make sure you pastor well. Make sure you shepherd well. Shepherd like Jesus would shepherd, because he is the chief shepherd. He will appear, and he will give you shepherds the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, it says, if you're younger in the church, make sure you're subject to the older people. And then not just younger people, everyone should clothe themselves in humility, because God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Then he turns towards every Christian and he says, hey, we all need to humble ourselves before the Lord. Remember, humble yourselves before the mighty hand of God. So at the proper time, he might exalt you. And also what that looks like is for you right now, casting your anxieties on him because he cares for you. You cannot cast your anxieties on God if you're a proud person. You won't do it. You'll hang on to your anxieties. You'll hang on to it and think, I'm going to make it through. I'm going to take care of my life. I'm going to take care of all this stuff. God says, cast your anxieties on him because he cares for you. And then in the meantime, you've got a lot of temptation to face in this world. It says, be sober-minded, be watchful. I mean, how many times has that word sober-minded come up in this book? It's come up a number of times in 1 Peter. What that means is to be ready, alert, ready to fight here. He says, your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. What you and I need to do is resist him, firm in our faith, knowing that the same kinds of sufferings that are being experienced right now are being experienced by people all around the world for Jesus Christ, by the brotherhood, right? These Christians all around the world. It says, after you suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you into eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. It says, you can trust that. Take that to the bank. That while you might suffer in this life, that's true. And a lot of that suffering has to do with the temptation you're going to face, where Satan's going to prowl around like a roaring lion seeking to devour you. The point is, you need to trust God. Cast your anxieties on the Lord, and he will care for you. We can know that we can trust God in all of this. As we read the book of Ezekiel and see all these promises, well, the one who promised all those things is faithful to take care of you and me today. That's an amazing truth that we should rely on every day. So thanks for reading. We'll see you back tomorrow for another daily Bible reading snapshot.